Yes. Let me hold it.
Let him hold it, bro.
Let me hold it.
Let him hold
Don't
it.
throw it.
Let him hold it.
I don't
Let him hold it.
I never held a baby rabbit.
Let him hold it.
No, dude, let me cut it. No.
Let him hold it.
You're gonna. I won't throw it. Swear to God. Put it on your kids. I can't do that. Get it. Don't be a slugs.
Let go of my kids. Let go of my kids.
What color is it? Brown?
Let him hold it.
Let me hold it. Alright, you're gonna kill it? No, I won't. Don't kill it. I won't kill it.
Just let go of my kids.
You better not kill it. I won't kill
He's
it.
gonna launch it.
Don't launch it. Don't be a dick.
There is a moment in law enforcement when trust becomes the only currency that matters. It is the quiet assumption that the person wearing a badge, carrying a weapon, operating under the full weight of legal authority, that person will not abuse that power, that they will not hurt the defenseless, that they will not point their gun at a colleague for sport. We want to believe that. In Grant County, New Mexico, that belief died in the summer of 2024. It did not die because of a missing person. It did not die because of a violent criminal. It did not die in a standoff or a pursuit or the kind of tragedy that makes headlines for all the right reasons. It died because of a rabbit, a small injured rabbit on the side of a road, helpless, alone, dependent entirely on whoever found it next. The officer who found it was Deputy Alejandro Gomez, 28 years old, employed by the Grant County Sheriff's Office, armed, in uniform, on duty. What happened next was filmed. What that footage revealed was not just one act of cruelty, it was a pattern, a culture, a department where violent behavior had become so normalized that it was documented, shared, and laughed at by the very people sworn to protect the public. By the end of 2024, 4 officers had been terminated. Gomez himself faced criminal charges, and an entire county would be asking itself a question it could not stop asking. How long had this been going on? This is that story. Grant County, New Mexico is not the kind of place you pass through on your way somewhere else. It sits in the southwestern corner of the state, pressed against the border of Arizona, surrounded by high desert and mountain ranges that turn cold the moment the sun goes down. The county seat is Silver City, a former mining town with wide streets and a history built on copper and grit. The population hovers around 28,000 people spread across nearly 3,000 square miles. Patrolling that kind of territory is exhausting work. Long shifts, long roads, long stretches of nothing. The Grant County Sheriff's Office handles everything outside city limits. The calls come in all shapes: domestic disputes, welfare checks, traffic accidents, on roads that have no shoulders and no lights. Deputies often work with minimal backup. The nearest support is sometimes 30 minutes away. On the night in question, August 2024, a group of deputies was out on patrol. Standard work. The kind of shift that feels the routine until it suddenly is not. Alejandro Gomez was one of those deputies. He had been with the sheriff's office long enough to hold a rank deputy and reportedly operating in a supervisory capacity that night. He was 28 years old. By all outward appearances, he was a functioning member of a law enforcement team. The night was quiet. Then someone spotted something small on the road. A rabbit, a young one, sitting near the edge of the pavement, disoriented, possibly injured from a passing vehicle. Vulnerable in the way that small animals are vulnerable, too small to run fast, too young to know when something dangerous is approaching. Whoever saw it first, the group stopped. And in that moment, a completely ordinary, even forgettable moment, a decision was made that would eventually unravel everything. There were options. This is worth saying clearly. There were multiple reasonable choices available to every person standing on that road that night. They could have driven past. An injured wild animal on a rural highway is not a law enforcement concern. They had calls to respond to. They had a county to patrol. They could have called the animal control. It was their job to deal with injured wildlife. They could have moved the animal off the road. A simple, humane act. 30 seconds of effort. They could have done nothing at all. Instead, Alejandro Gomez picked the rabbit up. What happens next is where any charitable interpretation ends, because Gomez did not pick up that animal to help it. He did not pick it up to move it to safety or to call for assistance. He picked it up and walked toward his patrol vehicle, and his colleagues watched. They did not intervene. They did not tell him to stop. One of them took out a phone. They started recording. This is the moment that should have ended differently, not because of what came next, though what came next was awful, But because of what it tells us about the environment those officers operated in, nobody hesitated, nobody questioned, nobody said the obvious thing, put the animal down and let it go. The camera was already rolling when everything changed. The footage is not long, but it is enough. According to investigators and news reports that later covered the case, Alejandro Gomez took the young rabbit and slammed it against the side of a patrol vehicle. He did it more than once. The animal did not survive. This was not a moment of panic. It was not self-defense. It was not the result of any legitimate law enforcement need. It was a deliberate act of violence against a small animal that posed no threat to anyone. And it was done in uniform, on duty, in front of colleagues, while being recorded. The same footage also captured other behavior from that night. Gomez, according to court documents and law enforcement reports, was also seen pointing a department-issued taser at fellow officers, not in response to a threat, not in a training scenario, in what was described as joking around, playing, the kind of thing that gets written off as locker room behavior right up until the moment someone gets hurt. He was also seen pointing his service firearm at colleagues, a loaded weapon, issued by the county, pointed at people he worked with, for fun. The video captured all of it, and then someone sent it outside the department. Law enforcement agencies have always had a complicated relationship with accountability. For most of history, misconduct that happened in the field stayed in the field. Officers reported to supervisors who reported to sheriffs, who reported to elected officials who had every incentive to protect the institution's reputation. Internal affairs investigations were conducted internally. Discipline, when it came, was often quiet. Social media changed that. The footage from that August night in Grant County did not stay inside the department. It circulated, it spread. By the time authorities became aware of how far it had traveled, it had already been seen by enough people to make containment impossible. The public reaction was immediate and severe. An officer killing a small animal in uniform, officers pointing weapons at each other. The casual, almost bored atmosphere in the footage, as though this was nothing, as though this happened all the time. People were horrified and angry. The anger found its way to officials quickly. The Grant County District Attorney's Office received the footage. The New Mexico State Police were notified. Calls for action came from residents, from advocacy groups, from people who had never paid attention to Grant County Sheriff's politics before in their lives. Inside the department, the calculations shifted fast. What had apparently been tolerated, or at least not formally addressed, was now on film. It had names attached to it, faces, badges. The question was no longer whether something would happen. The question was how quickly. The answer came faster than most people expected. When the New Mexico State Police opened their investigation, they were not starting from scratch. The video was not just evidence of a crime. It was a record, a time-stamped visual document of what happened, who was present, what was done, and who stood by and allowed it. In terms of investigative value, it was exceptionally strong material. State investigators coordinated with the Grant County District Attorney's Office, which would ultimately be responsible for any criminal charges. Investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame. They identified the officers present. They documented each distinct act of misconduct captured on camera. The animal cruelty was documented. The conduct with the taser was documented. The conduct with the service weapon was documented. Under New Mexico law, extreme cruelty to animals defined as intentional and malicious killing is a felony offense. The death of the rabbit was not accidental. It was not euthanasia. It was not a lawful act of any kind. The weapons conduct presented a separate set of serious concerns. Pointing a firearm at another person, even in a context described as play, meets the legal definition of assault with a deadly weapon in most jurisdictions. Intent to frighten is sufficient. The presence of a firearm elevates the severity of the conduct regardless of whether the weapon was discharged. As investigators compiled their file, a picture emerged not just of one bad night, but of a working environment in which this kind of behavior apparently felt safe to perform openly. That raised a question that would eventually be asked in public. Where was supervision? Interrogations are a test of narrative control. The officer sitting across from an investigator knows there is footage. The investigator knows the officer knows. Both parties are aware the footage exists, and both parties know what it shows. The question the interrogation seeks to answer is not what happened that is already visible, but why and what the subject is willing to acknowledge. In cases involving law enforcement defendants, this dynamic is particularly complex. Officers who have conducted interrogations themselves understand the techniques. They know the purpose of silence. They know how minimization works. They know that the first statement made in a formal setting becomes a foundation that everything else is built on. The interrogation of Alejandro Gomez when it occurred was conducted with all of that context in the room. What emerged, according to subsequent reporting and court documents, was a portrait of someone attempting to manage the narrative of actions that had already been captured in full. The rabbit, the taser, the firearm. Each had a camera pointed at it. Each had witnesses. None of it was deniable in any substantive way. The questions investigators ask in moments like this are rarely about the facts of the incident itself. The facts are documented. The questions are about intent, about context, about whether the subject understands the gravity of what was done, about whether there is any acknowledgement that rules legal, professional, human were broken. Whatever Gomez said in that room, it was not enough to redirect the course of the investigation. Charges were coming. The criminal case against Alejandro Gomez was built on two parallel tracks. The first was the animal cruelty track. New Mexico statute defines extreme cruelty to animals as the intentional or malicious torture, mutilation, or killing of an animal. It is a fourth-degree felony. A conviction can carry a sentence of up to 18 months in prison and a fine of up to $5,000. The statute exists because legislators recognize that animal cruelty is not simply a moral failing. It is a documented predictor of escalating violent behavior and a crime that causes real suffering. The footage of the rabbit's death was the core evidence on this charge. There was no alternative interpretation available. The act was deliberate. The outcome was fatal. The victim was an animal protected under New Mexico law. The second track was the assault track. Assault with a deadly weapon in New Mexico involves the use of a weapon, including a firearm, in a manner that would place a reasonable person in apprehension of immediate bodily harm. You do not have to fire the weapon. You do not have to make explicit threats. The act of pointing a loaded firearm at another person in a context where that person could reasonably fear injury meets the statutory threshold. The taser conduct added a separate dimension. Tasers are classified as weapons. Pointing one at a colleague without consent or legal justification is not a training exercise. It is a threat. Alejandro Gomez was arrested. He was charged with assault with a deadly weapon and extreme cruelty to animals. The charges were felonies, and he was not the only one who would face consequences that week. In the days following the public release of the footage, in the formal opening of the criminal investigation, the Grant County Sheriff's Office moved to address its personnel. 4 officers were terminated. 4. Alejandro Gomez was the primary subject of the criminal investigation and faced the most serious individual exposure. His termination was the least surprising element of the disciplinary action. But the dismissal of 3 additional officers sent a different kind of message. Those officers were present on the night in question. They witnessed the conduct. In some cases, they recorded it. They did not stop it. They did not report it internally. They allowed a colleague to kill an animal and to point weapons at fellow officers, and they treated it as entertainment. Under law enforcement standards, witnessing misconduct and failing to intervene or report it is itself a form of misconduct. Officers have a duty to act when they observe violations of law or policy. Standing by is not a neutral choice. Standing by and filming it is something else entirely. The decision to terminate all 4 officers reflected a recognition that the problem captured on camera was not a solo performance. It was a group failure. The culture that allowed it existed within a team, not just inside one person. 4 careers ended. 1 man walked out in handcuffs. And a county began asking questions about what else might have gone unseen. To understand what happened on that road in August 2024, it helps to understand how groups behave when authority is internalized differently than it is publicly claimed. Law enforcement culture has been studied extensively by psychologists, sociologists, and criminologists. What emerges from that literature is not a picture of uniformly good or bad people. It is a picture of institutional pressures that shape behavior in predictable ways. One of the most consistently documented phenomena is what researchers call the code of silence, the informal norm that officers do not report misconduct by colleagues. This is not unique to policing. It exists in military units, in hospitals, and corporate teams. It is a product of tight group identity, fear of retaliation, and a belief that loyalty to colleagues takes precedence over external accountability. In the Grant County footage, the code of silence was not even fully operative that night. The officers were not hiding what was happening. They were filming it. This is a different psychological state. This is a group that has collectively decided that what they are doing is not only permissible, but shareable. They did not perceive the risk of external exposure. They did not expect the footage to leave the group. They were operating in what psychologists might describe as an insular performance environment, behaving for an internal audience unaware that the audience might expand. The display of the taser and firearm toward colleagues is particularly revealing. Pointing a weapon at someone is a power act. It is a performance of dominance. In a group where that performance is met with laughter rather than alarm, the behavior is reinforced. It becomes part of the language of the group. Forensic psychologists who study officer misconduct often note that the most dangerous behavior occurs not when an officer acts alone, but when a group validates the behavior. Gomez did not appear to hesitate. He did not look around for approval. He acted as though his actions were normal, because in that group at that moment they were. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and it is a chilling one. Because if this behavior was normalized within that group, the question investigators and the public had to ask was, when did it start, and what else happened before anyone was watching? There is a tendency in crime coverage to focus entirely on the perpetrators, their psychology, their history, their decision-making, their crimes. The victims become props, context, set up for the story of someone else's fall. This story has an unusual victim, small, unable to testify, unable to tell its own story. An animal encountered on a road at night, alone, already injured, in need of help. What is worth saying about this victim is something simple. It was alive. It had pain responses. It experienced fear. When it was picked up, it may have struggled in the way that animals struggle when they sense danger, not with understanding, but with instinct. The most basic biological drive towards survival. That was not honored. The officers who stopped that night had the power to give that animal a different outcome. This is not sentimentality. This is not the elevation of animal life above human life. It is simply the acknowledgement that cruelty is cruelty, regardless of the size of the being on the receiving end of it. The broader public response to this case was driven not just by the weapons conduct, but by the rabbit. People across the country and beyond the state of New Mexico were angry about what was done to that animal. The reaction came from people who had never been to Silver City, people who had no opinion about Grant County politics, people who simply watched the description of that footage and felt the particular kind of moral revulsion that comes from witnessing the abuse of something completely defenseless. That feeling is not irrational. Research consistently shows that the capacity for empathy toward vulnerable beings, human or animal, is not a soft sentiment. It is a moral indicator. Cultures that suppress it tend to produce harm. The rabbit was a victim, small, unnamed, unlikely to appear in a formal victim impact statement. But it was the reason the story spread. And it was the reason 4 officers no longer held their badges. The story of Deputy Alejandro Gomez in the Grant County Sheriff's Office is not at its core a story about one man. It is a story about systems. When 4 officers are fired following a single incident, the obvious question is not just what those 4 officers did. The question is what existed around them. What culture permitted the behavior? What supervision structure failed to catch it before a camera did? What hiring and training processes produced officers who thought pointing a loaded weapon at a colleague was acceptable recreation? These are hard institutional questions, and they rarely produce satisfying answers. Institutions resist self-examination. The people responsible for oversight are often deeply embedded in the same culture that produced the problem. The case also illustrates something important about the role of documentation and accountability. Before the video, there was nothing. Whatever happened in that department on earlier shifts in earlier months, before anyone thought to hit record, none of it had been addressed. At least not visibly, not formally. The video changed everything. Not because the behavior was new, but because it was finally visible. This is both encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because it demonstrates that documentation produces accountability. A clear, unambiguous recording of misconduct is extraordinarily difficult to dismiss. The speed of the response in this case, 4 terminations, criminal charges, a state-level investigation, suggests that when evidence is undeniable, officials act. Troubling because the implication is equally clear. Without that recording, nothing would have changed. The public debate about police accountability in the United States has spent years focused on the use of body cameras, dashboard cameras, and civilian recording. The argument for those tools has always been simple. When people know they are being watched, behavior changes. And when behavior does not change despite cameras, at least there is a record. Grant County did not have a body camera policy robust enough to prevent this. The recording came from inside the group itself. The lesson is not just about cameras. It is about culture. It is about whether the people inside an institution feel safe enough and obligated enough to say when they witness something wrong, that it is wrong. 4 officers were terminated, 1 was criminally charged, but no one intervened on that road. That failure belongs to everyone who was there. By the end of 2024, the Alejandro Gomez case had moved through the New Mexico court system with the weight of documented evidence behind it. The charges assault with a deadly weapon and extreme cruelty to animals represented felony-level accountability for a person who had held a position of legal authority. His career in law enforcement was over. The criminal case proceeded. The Grant County Sheriff's Office was left to reckon with the institutional damage. 4 vacancies, a reputation fractured in public view, a community that now had undeniable reason to ask whether the people entrusted with their safety had fully earned that trust. The 3 officers who were not criminally charged but who lost their jobs had choices they did not make. They could have intervened. They could have reported what they saw. They could have done something other than point a phone at the scene and press record. The fact that they did not raises a question that no courtroom can fully answer. How do you train someone to say something when everything around them says to stay quiet? Institutions do not become corrupt overnight. They erode, slowly, through small permissions, through laughter in the wrong places, through silence when someone should have spoken. Grant County, New Mexico in August 2024 was not the first time a law enforcement agency confronted this. It will not be the last. But somewhere in the history of that department, before the cameras, before the video, before the terminations and the handcuffs, there was a moment when this could have gone differently. When one person could have said enough. No one knows when that moment was. That is the part that stays with you. A rabbit on a road, a group of officers, a phone recording, and a question that no criminal charge, no personnel file, and no official statement can fully answer. What do we do when the people we rely on to protect us become the threat? In Grant County, New Mexico in August 2024, the answer started with a video. The rest is still being written.